Hello everybody, how's it going today? Glowplasma 221 here, back in data about Kagurabachi, chapter number 67. This chapter is titled Kyoto Bloodshed Hotel. And man, did we get a Kagurabachi chapter this week, because I don't know about you guys, but I first read this like when the chapter came out. I think it was like 10 minutes after Viz had published a chapter on last Sunday, because I'm actually recording this on the Sunday afterwards, like 20 minutes before the next chapter of Kagurabachi actually comes out. So who knows, I may like be recording this video, the chapter come out, and then recording a new video right after this one, but who really knows at this point. But whenever I was reading this chapter for the first time, I was like, oh no, what's going to happen? Like, this is absolutely insane, and I just love Kagurabachi, and I really feel like that's just like the best way to read Kagurabachi chapters, is just to sit down, fully enjoy them, see what happens, and eventually see somebody who's been really sort of hyped up here for the past few chapters get absolutely mutilated by a character. And hey, this Kagurabachi chapter ticks off all of those boxes, so I say we're still here staying winning. So yeah, like I said, we got a really fun chapter of Kagurabachi today, this time all really focused around the Kyoto Bloodshed Hotel and events going on within it, not only with the general manager, Yojiro Sengoku, but also with Hiruhiko, who just got summoned into the main lobby floor by Todo, and of course Chihiro and Iori and all of the Masumi who are currently at their various positions within the hotel. We will be getting into all of that as the video sort of goes on and talking about what's going on and all of that sort of various stuff here. But hey, before we can talk about this chapter of Kagurabachi, we need to talk about what happened last time in Kagurabachi. And yes, I did just go over a brief amount of what happened, but really last chapter we got a whole lot of details on the Seitai War, which is the big war that happened a long time ago, 18 years in the Kagurabachi story, and it lasted about a year and 5 months. I don't know if we got that confirmation last chapter. Regardless of if we knew that for sure or not for sure, we also learned of the island of Shokoku, which was this mysterious island that appeared off the coast. And also, we just got a lot of introspection into Iori's character. She sits down and remembers her father, Seichi Samura, and all of the various things around there until she eventually passes out. Then, like I mentioned, on the ground floor of the hotel, we see that Todo is sitting here, and she pretty much summons Hiruhiko using the power of her sorcery. Sorcery is not allowed in the Kyoto Bloodshed Hotel, so somebody comes over and is not very happy with this, and Hiruhiko ends up killing them with a hairpin that then Hiruhiko uses to tie his hair back up in a really sensational and like amazing panel, right? And we start off this chapter of Kagurabachi in chapter number 67 in the same exact image that we saw last time, as Hiruhiko's just standing there holding the sword over his head with the hairpin sort of through the back of his head, pretty much just like making the nice little bun with all of Hiruhiko's hair. And Hiruhiko just is like, hey, Todo, so is Chihiro really still alive? And Todo says like, oh yeah, I saw him. I mean, he's protecting Samura's daughter. And we see that Hiruhiko's expression is sort of like, oh, I see, as he starts to like cry a little bit, as he sort of like to shake up in a little bit of a way. And Todo's like, huh, like, why are you crying here in this moment? As Hiruhiko just is like, hey, now I'm all pumped. I'll plow through the questioning nice and quick. And she's like, hey, are you sure you don't want some help here, Hiko? And he's like, no, I'm fine. Like, I'll take them all. As you see, a bunch of various swordsmen are all standing up, swords in their hands. And we even see that the general manager, Yojiro Sengoku, just is like, hey, who do you think you are, right? As we get the title drop of the chapter, chapter 67, Kyoto Bloodshed Hotel, as all of the various other people just sit down who are getting up with swords, as pretty much managers and Sengoku just is like, hey, I'll deal with this. As Todo just starts to think like, hey, all of the staff here are sword fighters, but there's a whole range of skill levels. The challenge will be that one big shot swordsman who has over 50 disciples, Yojiro Sengoku, the general manager. As Sengoku starts to walk out from behind the reception desk, and he's got his sword in his hand, he just says like, hey, this hotel has rules. You bear the Hishaku emblem on your hand. I hear you all are quite skilled. And here he goes like, oh, so you oppose me alone? And Sengoku just is like, oh, of course. The art of the sword has been passed down of this hotel. I am its history. As we see that he gets his sword ready and gets it ready in sort of a unique position, sort of like holding the hand, holding the hilt of the sword over his head, and the blade sort of pointing down towards the ground. He says, Reagan one sword style. As he runs up and swings the blade into Hiruhiko's blade, Hiruhiko's able to parry it with their hand. And they're like, oh golly, like that's really, really heavy, right? As Toto just thinks like, hey, Hiruhiko is a top tier sorcerer, but when it comes to sword techniques, he's never really properly trained, which is, of course, we saw that he was supposed to get properly trained by Kagiri a few chapters ago, but then Hiruhiko just says like, you know what, I don't want to be doing any of that, right? But Toto just is like, hey, and in his current state with all of our access to sorcery, like an opponent like this, she's just like, hey, I'm honestly really scared, so I'm probably just going to stay still here in this moment, right? So we see that Hiruhiko is able to like keep this blade off as he sort of parries it. Sengoku goes in for another one. Hiruhiko gets ready, swings the sword down as Toto just looks over and is like, oh no, this is not looking good whatsoever. As Hiruhiko just thinks back to whenever, of course, Kagiri was supposed to train him, as he just thinks like, wow, if swordplay makes such a difference, as he remembers the whole thing of where Kagiri just says like, hey, we'll begin on the basics. The forms are crucial. They're the crystallization structure of the style, right? And he also remembers whenever he was talking to Chihiro, whenever Chihiro had him pinned down, and he just says like, hey, very soon we will step into the same ring. Of course, talking about him getting to Iori Enchanted Blade. And here Hiruhiko just thinks like, hey, even with an enchanted blade, if my sword fighting is bad, then I won't be in the same ring at all. Which is, of course, what Hiruhiko wants. They want to be as close to Chihiro as they possibly can. As we then see that General Manager Yokoro Sengoku is getting ready to come at Hiruhiko with another attack, as he's just like, okay, be prepared to be swallowed alive by 150 years of history. And he's sort of like holding the blade forward, and they're just getting ready to go through and ram and pierce Hiruhiko straight through. Hiruhiko just remembers to that whole thing of like, hey, Chihiro, we will face off as equals. As Hiruhiko is holding the blade behind their head in this moment, and in this sort of movement, they drop the blade behind their head, duck down to get out of the way of Sengoku's attack, hold the blade in a certain way so it's parallel to their arm, and swing up as Sengoku sort of dashes through Hiruhiko. Hiruhiko falls on the ground and like sort of has to regain his footing in this moment. And Sengoku is just standing there, sword in his hand. And Toto sort of makes a reference of like, hey, you sure you don't want my help in this moment? And Hiruhiko's like, hey, actually no. And he's like, hey guys, I'd rather you all come at me all at once. And a few of these like various hotel worker grunts are just like, hey, I mean, you're barely managing to dodge General Manager Sengoku's things. Like, how could you possibly? As we see a little bit of blood splatter hits on the side of Sengoku's face, as we look down and we see that one of his arms has been completely cut off. It looks like it's cut off a little bit above the elbow in this moment, and it is his left arm that gets cut off, which is not his sword-bearing arm at all. Of course, his sword-bearing arm is his right arm. So he's not really that wounded by this, but still, it's not very good. As everybody's sort of like, oh my gosh, like that's crazy, and even Toto has like a, whoa, my gosh, right? As Sengoku just thinks about what just happened, just thinking like, hey, just now he took a totally unorthodox path. I couldn't even read where the blade came from. I couldn't even read where the blade came from. As we see that Sengoku's just like, hey, whose disciple are you? And we see that Hiruhiko just is like, hey, I mean, you're just so pig-headed. Why do I have to be someone's disciple? I'm a student of freedom. Cue up the American Eagle sound effects. Get it already. Hiruhiko's an American character. He is the student of freedom, which I don't know why. I just think that's a really hilarious line, but I really like how Hiruhiko is holding the sword behind him, as we see that he's sort of like holding his arm like outstretched and like the palm flat reaching towards the sky above him, and he is sort of just like balancing this sword behind him in this way. It's a little bit of like an interesting way to hold a sword. I don't know. It just gives Hiruhiko just a lot of really cool aura. Just be like, damn, that's pretty cool, right? But Sengoku then just says like, hey, there won't be a next time. As we then cut away from this battle, as we cut up to the Pine Room where, of course, Chihiro and Iori are currently sitting in. Here in a second, we will learn that the Masumi are all on the roof, of course, making Iori's new seal in this moment. But we see that Iori has sort of woken up from her little bit of a slumber after she sort of passed out from, like, the information overload of realizing everything about her father in the moment. And Chihira's like, hey, Iori, how are you feeling, right? And she's like, oh, hey, what time is it? As Chihiro just says that dawn is just breaking. So, of course, the last time we were sort of indoctrinated to all of this, it seems like Iori slept for about 18-ish hours, if not like 17 to 16, because we don't know the full timeline here, but it seems like Iori has been sleeping for a good amount of time here in the moment. As Chihiro just says that, she then asks, like, hey, morning, okay, where are the Masumi? And she even makes a little bit of a note of, like, hey, so sad it's so dark outside, of course, with Samura's owl sort of just, like, looking down over the entire city and this entire scene, like, all of the lights blocked out, so it sort of looks like this eternal night sort of deal in this moment. Chihiro then just says, like, hey, the Masumi are all on the roof, working on the final stages of preparing the seal in this moment, right? And Chihiro just says, like, hey, I am here to guard you. And she's like, oh, I mean, were you here all night? And Chihiro just says, like, no, only this part requires all three of them, so we traded off during the night, so I wasn't by your side the entire time, right? And Chihiro just says, like, hey, they taught me some good battle techniques, and I practiced some sword techniques too, right? And Iori's like, hey, but what about your sleep? Like, don't you need it, right? And she even says, like, hey, you seem totally used to this stuff, Chihiro, like, but we are also the same age, aren't we? And Chihiro's just like, yeah, we are. And she's like, hey, but what about school? And he's like, hey, I've actually never gone. And Iori just says, like, hey, so what you're saying is that you've sort of been, like, enmeshed in all of these bloodbaths this entire time. I mean, for students like us, stealing each other's desserts at lunchtime and competing for test scores and playing drawing games, those were our fierce battles. As Chihiro just says, like, hey, I mean, that sounds really peaceful. And Iori just sort of makes a note of, like, hey, I mean, all of my friends at school are probably worrying about me now. She's like, hey, I really miss them. As Chihiro sort of just, like, takes a very, like, glancing looking over at Iori, sort of, like, sympathizing with her in this way. And she just says, like, hey, and before I fell asleep, I seem to remember something, as she remembered all of the graffiti on the wall of her family home whenever she sort of met up with Samura for that first, or whenever she remembered that time she was holding Samura's hand all that long ago. And she just says, like, hey, if I can go back to my original self, I can't live the life I have now. I mean, I really won't be able to go to school again. And Chihiro's like, yeah, it's really one or the other. You go back to your original life knowing who Seiichi Samura is, or you go back to school and that's just sort of how it is. You forget everything and you can relive the life that you've been used to for the past little while. And Iori's sort of sitting here in silence, and eventually Chihiro just says, like, hey, my last name is Rokuhira. And Iori's like, oh, Rokuhira? And she's like, and Chihiro's like, yes, my father was Kunishige Rokuhira. He and your father, Seiichi Samura, were great friends. And he says, like, hey, we're children of the war heroes. Our circumstances are really kind of familiar. So I had this idea that it's better to live with the truth, even if it hurts. But I guess that was really arrogant of me. As we see that Chihiro starts to continue just saying, like, hey, you have, but before he can finish this sentence, we see that the doorbell starts ringing in the room as we just hear, like, the ding dong, as Chihiro gets ready to go and sort of walk to the door and see what's sort of up. As he just sort of heads over, is like, hey, I'll go look, and he sort of goes over, and whenever he opens the door, we see there's just a random sorcerer guy standing there with a knife in his hand. He sort of jabs into Chihiro as he sort of enters the door trying to get, like, a surprise attack or something, right? Chihiro then goes and pins this guy on the ground and says, like, hey, who are you and what do you want here in this whole situation? And the guy just says, like, hey, money. I mean, somebody called my room and they promised me a massive pile of money, you know? And we see that Chihiro looks up, and we see that coming out of almost every other room are a bunch of just general sorcerers just walking out, swords in their hands, getting ready to attack. Chihiro sort of just thinks, like, okay, they're heading to this room, so clearly we are just being targeted. He's like, okay, what is really going on here? As he looks back to Iori, who's gotten out of bed, he says, like, hey, Iori, stay in there, as he closes the door up and locks it, as Iori sort of just, like, runs up to the door to see what's going on, and she just gets up, and she looks through the peephole on this door, and she sees on the outside Chihiro swinging around his blade, cutting up all of these various people, and just blood spattering everywhere, as she sort of just, like, sees Chihiro's shadow sort of disappear through the peephole, and then blood just completely covers it in its entirety, right? And as all this happened, she was just, like, looking out and sort of, like, grimacing and, like, seeing all of this. As eventually she hears Chihiro's voice from outside say, like, okay, Iori, it's okay now. Like, it's all right, all of that various stuff. And she looks outside and is like, oh my god, whoa, like, what's going on out here? And she sees all of the blood just splattering the walls of the Bloodshed Hotel as Chihiro's just standing there in the middle of everything. And Iori's just like, hey, aren't you scared? And Chihiro just says, like, hey, those guys weren't elite fighters, and there's probably more on the way. Let's go and get to the roof. And we even see that Chihiro makes note of, like, shoot, like, I'm not there for my sword style yet. Like, even with all the practice I put in, I'm not absolutely perfect in this moment, right? And Iori's like, hey, no, that's not what I mean. I meant, like, of killing all of these various people. And Chihiro's like, no, I'm not scared at all. And he's like, hey, I'm not like you, and this is the only life that I have now. But you, both of those lives are your truths. There's no right answer, and nothing that you should do. It's all about what you want. As he thinks, like, hey, your two options: to have a life as Samura's daughter, or a peaceful alternate existence, right? As we see that Chihiro goes and presses the button to send him up the elevator to go up all the floors to the roof, he presses the button, and Iori's sort of standing here just saying, like, hey, I want to go back to school. As Chihiro just hears this, and she's just thinking, like, hey, I don't have a choice. All I have is. As we see that the elevator dings, the elevator arrives up here on the floor, and we see the face of General Manager Sengoku looking through it. Arguably, it looks a little bit bloody, but we see his face as the elevator opens up, and we see none other than Hiruhiko standing here in the elevator, one sword in his right hand, and the head of Yojiro Sengoku in his other. As we see Hiruhiko's just holding Sengoku's head by the hair in this moment. And we have this really awesome panel just seeing Hiruhiko and Chihiro just staring off at each other. Of course, Chihiro has two swords on his side and one sword sort of in his hand in this moment, as we sort of see these two rivals facing off against each other. As we see that Hiruhiko's like, yo, Chihiro, I'm ready for you, right? And we see that Iori is standing behind Chihiro, really freaking out, like, oh my god, what is going on? As Chihiro just grabs one of his swords, gets it in an EI position, and just says, like, hey, don't worry, I promise I'll get you back. Of course, directing this towards Iori as we end off this chapter of Kagurabachi. Man, this was just such a fun chapter. I mean, going through and seeing Hiruhiko just, like, really fight with General Manager Sengoku, just going through, like, pairing things back and forth, just like, wah, wah, wah. And then that really unique sword style of dropping the sword and then getting it in a way that it slices off the General Manager's arm in this fashion. Of course, it will have just sliced off the arm there, but it looks way more cooler whenever the arm sort of, like, flops off after everybody thinks that everything has been generally okay so far. Really cool image that we see there. And I'm sorry, my stomach is really growling. I'm gonna need to go get some food after this recording here. But and then seeing Hiruhiko's whole thing of, like, hey, I'm a student of freedom. It is such a funny line. I don't know how else to phrase that besides, like, man, that's just really, really funny. But then seeing, like, Chihiro go through, mess up all of these people, and we finally get Iori's decision of, oh my gosh, I know what my plan is now. I want to go back to school. And of course, I don't think it's going to work out that way. I think that Iori is going to have to end up being part of the main cast in some sort of reliable fashion or some sort of way right there. I don't think everything's going to go as much of a sunshine and rainbows approach as we're all sort of hoping for, but I'm sort of really here for it. I saw this really fun theory on, I forget if it was Twitter or Reddit, looking through the Kagurabachi subreddit or the Kagurabachi Twitter group or Twitter community, but I saw somebody said, like, hey, I think what's going to happen here is that Iori's going to have to grab a blade to defend herself, and that it's going to be Inten, and being that Chihiro was killed and the owl has gone up, he hasn't reforged his bond with Inten yet, which means that Iori may be contracted to it, which means that Samura may show up and accidentally kill or get ready to really harm Iori before he realizes what he is doing to make, like, the ultimate stalemate. I thought that was, like, a really, really fun theory that I saw, but really, it's just going to be fun for next chapter, because, like I said, the next chapter comes out here in, like, a few minutes, or actually it may be up by the time I'm recording. Let me actually reload this page and see if chapter number 68 is now out. So I'm probably going to finish up this video, read that chapter, go get food, and then come back up and record a video on it. But, like, I'm really excited to see what happens next in this whole battle. Like, hey, it looks like Hiruhiko and Chihiro are going to be sort of getting their first round 2 of what I presume to be mini battles between the two of them. And also, like, hey, what's happening with Iori here? I'm just very excited to sort of just see all of this. And yeah, thank you guys so very much for watching this video on Kagurabachi chapter number 67. Of course, this chapter was titled, what was it again? Yes, Kyoto Bloodshed Hotel. I do plenty of other anime and manga related content here on the YouTube channel. Mostly here recently, it's just been weekly Shonen Jump videos and Kagurabachi videos, being that I am a full-time college student and I don't always have all the time to make all these really fun and interesting videos, in my opinion at least. If you guys don't seem as fun and interesting, well, I will just say that's your problem, but hey, whatever. But yeah, with all that being said, I'll have a place of all my other Kagurabachi chapter reviews linked in the description box down below, and also as an in card on this video. And you can also just go, like, click my channel icon and just go check out all the other videos I've made. I think I've made, like, 375 videos, somewhere around there. So I've got plenty uploaded on the channel. So yeah, without further ado, with all that being said, I'll catch you guys next time for Kagurabachi chapter number 60. Again, this was chapter number 67, titled Kyoto Bloodshed Hotel. And yeah, I'll catch you guys next time. Thank you guys so very much for watching. This will be Glowplasma 231 signing out. Again, thanks for watching, Bachi Bros.